Today we're speaking with Bob Anderson, a veteran producer and co-founder of Classic Worldwide Productions. Throughout his long and storied career, Bob has been involved in shooting, directing, and producing a variety of projects in locations around the world, including at the Titanic site. We joined Bob in Richfield, Ohio, as he recounts lessons from those jobs, as well as the three biggest elements that every creative professional needs to employ in their jobs in the future. Well, today we're here with Bob Anderson, who is one of the co-founders of Classic Worldwide Productions, as well as a producer and a director. So tell me a little bit about when you were co-founder of Classic Worldwide. What was that organization and what did you do for the company?
When we first began Classic Worldwide Productions, Jerry and I had worked together a number of years prior to that, and we'd both had other experiences in advertising agencies or production companies. And when we ended up going together, one of the biggest advantages was we could acquire equipment and had immediately, on a handshake basis, a large duplication client that had the whole series of afternoon syndicated programs. And it was called the Hollywood Network. And so we thought that we would get started with already in hand major duplication. We had also several other clients, and so we thought that would give us a foundation to also produce other content. We had also perfected at that time the method of doing the lip synchronized translation in multiple languages. The previous program we had was being released in 91 languages every week. So we had a lot of translation work too in the early days, as well as then going out and producing activities for training, program, commercials, events, and documentaries.
So you mentioned you had a role as really a producer and director in a lot of ways. What were some of the projects that you have produced and directed over the years?
Prior to coming into Classic, I had worked with a global ministry, and I was responsible for producing and directing and expanding from the English language, and that was in an 18-month period to 91 languages globally. Following that, we started then in 1975 going out and having follow-up meetings in many of these countries. And so that expanded into a very dynamic range of creating specials, events, setting up media in these various countries, and working with many different cultural traditions as well as political frameworks, because most media and many of the event venues were controlled by national political structure. And then within those next 3 or 4 years, we were literally meeting in person, literally millions of the people that we were reaching by the television outreach and radio. As we got into Classic, we started doing other worldwide events that took us all the way to 2 expeditions on the Titanic. And then also we found that the direct marketing groups wanted to come up with some of the same things that we were able to do in Christian broadcasting, was to establish a database of names and personalize the information. So direct marketing came to us, and we were doing literally, did hundreds if not into 1,000 of direct marketing products. So it ended up being quite diverse and animating products like for Frito-Lay, the Chester Cheeto animations and things for their Latin American markets. We produced in about 80 some countries.
I mean, that's quite a list of clients that you've had and projects that you've done before. Is there any one or two in particular maybe that stand out in your mind as being particularly impactful? You know, when talking about the Titanic, I'm sure that's an experience that you'll never quite forget.
The largest body of water that I really had encountered, other than the Missouri River, was my neighbor's pond, and if you fell in, it might be knee-deep in water and a couple of feet of mud below that, It wasn't exactly the oceanographic kind of adventure. But I had to become quite immersed in that, so I became what was qualified as a Titanic expert, and even lectured on the Titanic and traveled in quite a few places. And even when the 100th anniversary book, one of the editions of the 1912 book was republished, I was asked to do the introduction in the 100th anniversary book as the Titanic explorer. But the challenge was, there is a real dramatic effect of gravity as it presses farther and farther to the center of the Earth. And when you're down 2.5 miles under the sea, the pressure is like being under 1,250 feet of lead. So the dynamic pressure that is surrounding every operation into the deep ocean is one of the major sort of technical challenges to cross over. And we had the astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who had walked on the moon on that first lunar landing, and he said as he took a dive to the Titanic, and when he came back up, I spoke to him right as he stepped out, and he said he had the same words and thoughts as he did on the moon as he saw the surface of the deep ocean is magnificent desolation, is the way it was described. And you do find it to be sort of this desolation, but there's something very spectacular about it. And it began also the opportunity to do other things, producing several other specials with the Discovery Channel, some about the Titanic, and I became very involved in the Titanic story, and actually hosted the 1996 event on site as being the voice of the Titanic expedition. And that was supposed to be by a guest host, Alan Alda, who was a qualified host. When he didn't arrive, they turned to me and said, "Bob, you're gonna have to do it." So I became the voice of the Titanic expedition in 1996, and then a lot of things to follow that made it quite an interesting experience.
No, it's interesting, and I mean, going back to a comment you made, you were talking about that you learned lessons, not only about sort of the medium and the water and the earth, but also just in production and how you manage equipment at that pressure level at the bottom of the earth. Did you find often that you would learn lessons like that on a particular project that would carry over into others, and can you share any of those with us?
Oh, absolutely. My experience is I'm always learning, oftentimes from oversight of something. I guess I should say a mistake, So several things that are interesting. On the Titanic project, we were on only an 86-foot long ship that most of it was accommodating a submersible that could go to the deep ocean. And so there was very little other space on that ship. So we set up a studio that was in a 7-foot by 7-foot room, but it had a doorway into another, what we called the wet lab, where all of the items that were being retrieved from the Titanic in the debris field and brought on board were brought into the wet lab. But I ended up having to set the camera into that room to and shoot through the doorway into this 7 by 7-foot box. Setting up a backdrop for this small studio space, first of all, I got out my little torpedo level to only realize as the ship is rocking and rolling and rocking and rolling, a level at sea doesn't mean anything. We found too that setting up the equipment on a ship doesn't work like I would on land, because the minute the ship moved from the dock, all the equipment on the table was on the floor. It just started, so we started anchoring down everything. And on the switcher, during one of the interviews, we could not get enough light. It was just, I couldn't open the camera up. It was dark. And then after we finished the interview, trying to go back through this whole system after putting tons of light on this poor historian there, we nearly roasted him trying to get enough image through there to find that a tape had shifted and bumped into the fader bar on the mixer. So it was faded half to black. And we kept trying to get more out of it with lighting. And so sometimes just check all the positions. We normally do, like make sure it's plugged in. Sometimes those are things. Troubleshooting sometimes starts with just the common sense sort of trail. But we didn't find that until after that interview. We recorded him and he was so toasted after that. And I felt bad. So those things can get you. And possibly one of the more interesting ones that also entails a little bit of tragedy too, doing a helicopter ending on a dynamic bicentennial event at the Statue of Liberty in the harbor in New York. We had tested it all out, and we had to go out there at 4 in the morning again to set this up. Had to be off the island before the first guest at 9. And so we were shooting this right at the early hours. And so I had 2,000 2-foot in diameter red, white, and blue helium-filled balloons to make this bubble of sort of patriotic bubble up surrounding the Statue of Liberty. And then I had 500 of these white, what looked like doves in the picture of flying off, homing pigeons that came over from a supplier in New Jersey. What I did not know, though, there was some mix up, and I learned of this, and this has made me even a little more cautious about my checklist on things, because I'd requested the 500 birds, the 2,000 balloons, and everything was out there. The first day we go in on the event itself. It had been rehearsed several times, very tight kind of maneuvering with the helicopters slide around the crown, down, and then sort of glide away, and that's a difficult maneuver for the helicopters. We were all out there with the cameras on the mounts, and I was there cueing everything. Jerry was on the ground there with a starter pistol that like you would use in track and field, so everybody could do the releases that were hidden around in the bushes and behind the structures. And we called for the balloons, and this bubble of red, white, and blue just caressed the whole Statue of Liberty, and it was a beautiful sight. And then I called for cue the birds, and he cued the birds, and I kept saying, cue the birds. And then I would scream, cue the birds. This is a one-take deal. And I see just a couple birds flying away. Where's my 500 white doves? After finding, trying to track down this issue, everybody was mounted all the way to the top crevices of the statue, and they had this, it's like a wooden box, and these birds are all slid into these cavities, and then they could open the box, tilt it, and they would just fly out. These birds had their wings clipped and could not fly. So the tragic loss was to drop 500 white pigeons to their death with clipped wings off of the Statue of Liberty. So some things you start learning, check the details, check the details, check the details. And so the other things that happened too is that I was in the Sudan in a refugee camp. They had 60 young men under 16 years old returning from slavery, and they were doing a big feast for them. And I was just dropped in there for 2 weeks in these 6 refugee camps by myself with a backpack, and I'm recording this. I'd hit the record, and I'd look down, and it wasn't recording, so I hit it again. I found that in my excitement, I wasn't that the record mode on some cameras, the one I was using, had about a 2.5 second delay before it popped into record. And I'd glance in the viewfinder to make sure I'm recording. When it wasn't recording, I'd hit it again, you know? And what I was doing is I was recording these little bits and shutting it off. So I recorded most of me moving between scenes rather than the event itself. I got some of it because I was just able to do that by accident more, but I learned my lesson there. So I had to learn again that make sure you know the equipment better than I did. And after that, I certainly learned that as well. So there's a lot of things that you have to learn how to set up the equipment to come up with the performance that you want.
You've had a long and storied career, so you've been on a variety of different projects, and I'm sure while you can look back at some of maybe the failures and pull lessons out of them, I know with all the projects that you've been on, so many of them have been very, very successful, and I think a lot of maybe those in the new generation can kind of look to that and see, okay, there are big projects you can be on, you can still make mistakes, but you can still recover from it.
It is a good thing that we learn a lot about grace. And so I think of a couple of things that were important to kind of keep a scope on is the technology has been moving. You know, I shot early on with 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter film, and even recorded back in the early 70s a cell animation where you were in multiple plane animation, so you just didn't change it on one frame. So I would do multiple cell animation and multiple plane animation. And I, on 2-inch quad tape, did a 30-second commercial with 900 edits on every frame, and did animation, and it played for nearly a decade and had at the last count, over $8 million of airplay. And it was done on a crudely made 2x4 stand with a TK44 camera that took 2 men to lift on each side, and the lens was a 2-man lens connected and had it pointed straight down through the animation, and painted cells. This is before any electronic animation. This would have been in 1974. And so one of the things that I often think of is technology is going to change. We need to understand technology, and then how do we use it? But on that note too is that most people are limited more than budget and more than time is the creative dimension. So I encourage myself to say, okay, understand what the objectives are of a project. Most projects have not been mine personally. I've been producing for others who have asked me to help them. If I can't help them bring it to a higher point of the threshold they're trying to cross, then why use me? You know, I'm just a tag along. What we need to do is not be out here to compete, but to lead. And by leading is taking the objectives of the project in a brainstorming session that doesn't cost other than a little bit of time and some mental focus, is to say, okay, think big. I feel like that's the biggest part of media. We have tools that are great. So, but if we don't apply them, we are just sort of rolling with the rest of the dust, sort of like tumbleweeds, you know? And we're not impactful. So we can be far more when we think big. Now, some people say, but I don't have money. That's a bad mental state to start with. In brainstorming, you have everything. Now, we have to get practical. So there's a side, plan big. And so we need to plan all the details out very thoroughly. If there was ever 2 aspects of production or media, event planning, or whatever it might be, the biggest one is think big. The second most important one is to plan. And that means you plan out even alternate conditions. I've always had, basically rain day options. So I don't waste the production crew, the production dollars, or the people. We can go immediately to plan B. So plan big for your think big objectives. And then you can actually start on a plan determining the cost and what I consider value. Some people chop off the legs of a project's effectiveness by costing it from just a cost standpoint. But if every venture was like that, there would be no net increase in many. So it is like, what is the value? Sometimes an animated graphic, for example, may help bring the audience to the understanding that the presenter wants. And you just don't tell them, but you show them. And it's a media of show and tell. Otherwise, we would call it radio. And so I've seen some people effectively produce a lot of television that made good radio. And that's not our objective. So is plan big, think big, and then the next part is to execute boldly. As an example, I saw projects that I had done that were pretty expensive, and then they would make up duplicates and sort of send them out, and people would just watch that. They didn't exactly have a way to interact and respond. And so I decided that I would tell some of them, why don't we consider having a world premiere? And this was this one, it was a 501c3 group, and they were somewhat small, but they had made a production. It was fairly sensitive about their work with disabled individuals, those affected as children and on up, and they had a dynamic outreach and effect. And so we ended up, in the discussion, they caught on and said, okay, they'd always just handed them out to people, and the people go home and maybe play it or maybe not. So they did a big event, made it with a red carpet. We brought the kids who were starring in this with their parents in tux and gowns, and in limos, and had the lights going on outside. We made this a world premiere. And then they had several hundred, 600 or 800 people come to this world premiere. And then these young kids who had been quietly just over in the disabled community and being nurtured very well, but kind of quiet, all of a sudden were breakout stars. And they had this event that in the one night did more than they ever dreamed of having support and income, because they had interaction with the people as they were viewing. Then they brought up the stars of the show and were presented their own little Oscar. And then also, oftentimes, it's what do you do beyond that? In the think big category, how do we build relationship? Not just media, but a relationship with a loyalty base that will go on and on. And the better we serve the target audience, the more active they can become and the more successes we can see. And so I see today is the technology to build this relationship is far more than just a storyline one way. And it is being rejected more and more. People don't want to just be talked at. They want to start interacting and responding. And very few people today at any age group sets for 20 minutes, and we used to have hour-long programs and other things, and now, people are going off and whatever, and then you even get to watch a 60-second spot, and spots are down to 5 seconds,
Attention spans are gone.
Yes, and yet I've seen some of the same people start playing on their phone with their thumbs and stay there for 2 hours at a time. Is it their attention spans are gone, or we're not reaching them? And when I see relationships can be built, we need to take those kind of tools and apply them into effective ways to serve an audience well. And if we do that, we build a relationship. So a product is not in that think big. We need to have an ongoing connectivity with good reason for that audience to participate. But we should lead with great service through the technology.
No, it's an interesting point, and I think I've heard you talk about how important it is to know your audience before you create a product. I know you've spoken very passionately about that before, but in what ways can a media professional know their audience in order to serve them with better products?
When you have a guest to your house, if you understand who they are, and you might be able to make a real pleasant menu and meal. If you don't know and there's a bunch of them and you come up with one thing you're stuck on, some of them may not enjoy the meal. And I've been in homes like that, especially traveling around the world. There's some people that really like hot spices, and there's nothing else but hot spices, and I have had to have this giant fireball in my stomach till and try to be gracious. But what we have to do is be sensitive to the interest and the focus of the audience. Example, today's world is actually a marketplace globally. So if we do it in a single language, whatever that language might be, we've automatically limited a great deal of our connectivity. And matter of fact, in the United States alone, a Spanish-speaking market is greater than the total number of people who occupy the continent of Australia. So if you want to reach an audience the size of Australia in population, you could translate a Spanish version and have that big of an audience domestically in the United States. So some things like music selection, some things like the hosting, whoever's the presenting and the voice of that, is it youthful, is it energetic, or is it mature in some way and more confident by age, or is it reaching an audience that has certain expectations? So we need to think of that all the way through. And so the type of color and graphic, the type of font, and how it's the contrast and the veil, how it's really read, and even the size of the font. And oftentimes we have to consider now even the device it's played on. And is it vertical? Is it horizontal? Is it on a large supersized screen, or is it on a handheld device like a cell phone? And so all of those things become a consideration of who is using it and how they're using it.
No, I appreciate your insight in that, because the audience is so important. I mean, you can probably make all sorts of different kinds of content, but if you don't have a distribution channel and people to watch it, then it doesn't matter whatever you're creating. But I'm curious if you have any other sort of parting thoughts or advice for those of us who want to break into video production or get into this industry. I guess, what advice would you give to someone in that position?
Now, I found myself very complicated trying to find my way into a career. I remember as a college freshman, every time they'd ask me to mark down, what my career objective vocation would be, I seemed to rotate sort of just around the whole clock of, I'd be this, So I went to the campus at the University of Missouri and went through their whole career and took all this tests of what my interest might be. 3 psychologists there looking at this bewildered country boy. They all gathered up and said, I think that you're best suited to be a mortician. Well, I never quite got into that. I never dug that career, so to speak. But then somewhere along the line, I went back to college, had to get a job. I got a job in the television department, and I found a real comfort zone. So first of all, you have to find your comfort zone of a pursuit. And then I looked at what could I do with that. A part of it is find that spot, find that comfort zone, and then back to that. Think big, plan big, execute boldly. And those things will set you apart. And it's really, there was no reason for some kid from Missouri to be out doing a Titanic expedition. But I helped them think big, and they said that's what they want. And then they came back in the next expedition. I produced that with them as well in '98, is that they want to think big. And so if you can use and understand tools to help people think big and execute boldly and develop the strong plan to make it happen, you can certainly do that. And we found that that's something worldwide. And so we've built studios and facilities and give consultation around the globe for networks, just because trying to help them execute at a higher level.
I appreciate your insight and your advice into that. If people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can email for certain. It's B Anderson, B as in Bob, and then Anderson, so B Anderson at classicworldwide.com. And I look forward to that and to get acquainted with anyone and to encourage anyone, because we can be an impact player from a lot of perspectives of standing alongside of a lot of people who present and share big stories.
Appreciate your time, Bob. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.